Hi, my name is Betsy Bohan, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel. I'm a nurse of over 40 years with a passion for helping people. Today I'm going to be doing something that's very special and something that I've thought about for actually years and have been encouraged to do for years because people felt that it would be able to benefit others, but it had to be at the right time. If you've not watched my video that I did last week about why I'll be sharing my testimony, I would encourage you to do that. If not, in a nutshell, the reason I'm sharing my testimony or my personal story of before and after Jesus is for two main reasons. One, testimonies are part of the Christian life. It's part of encouraging others, to encourage them when you've come through something hard so that others can see and learn from you as I have learned from others and am encouraged. And so it helps us to not get discouraged and give up and not progress. And another second reason is also because of being a nurse for 40 years, I actually took the Florence Nightingale pledge twice, once as a LPN, once as a RN. And part of the pledge is making a commitment that whatever you can do to better the health of your community, you will do. Part of that means making myself vulnerable enough to share parts and portions of my story that will help others. And so that's what I'm doing with my husband's permission, and of course, as I mentioned before in last week's video, with the permission of my parents as well, who have long since passed. So I'll meet you back here in a moment, and I will be sharing with you my testimony and my story. I'm going to be reading it actually from what I wrote, just so that I keep on task and don't go off in rabbit trails. And everything that I'm saying to you has already passed the ears of my husband first. Okay, I'll see you back in a moment. Hi and welcome back. This is my testimony. This is my story, titled The Social Worker's Daughter, The Power of Love, Faith, and Forgiveness. To be sure, my life, if anything, is a picture of the human condition, both before and after Jesus. It's a story of how good people can intend and hope and plan to do good, but fall short, sometimes terribly short, into a pit of destruction. And yet, it's a testimony to a living hope found in God and the power of love, faith, and forgiveness. It is the story, my testimony of the social worker's daughter. I was raised in a family of 5 children. Us first 4 were approximately 2 years apart in age, with the last coming in as a surprise and delight 10 years later. I was the middle child with 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers. My mother stayed home to care for us, as many women did in the 1950s and 60s. My father was a social worker because he had a heart for helping those in need. Now, I want to step back here a little bit just to give you some of my parent background. My mother was the 10th of 12 children. She was the 3rd youngest and the youngest of 7 girls. She was quite a gal. She was quick and loved games outdoors. When the kids in the neighborhood played a game involving a ball and it went into the goat's pen, the other kids would shout and yell her name and say, "Jump over the fence! Jump over the fence!" She was fast and could get in and grab the ball and throw it out before a goat would butt her. She was a good student, graduated high school, and became a court reporter in a county courthouse, living in a boarding house of an older woman with other single working women. She enjoyed outings and adventures with her friends, beautiful with dark hair, blue eyes, and a quick smile. She enjoyed jokes and a good laugh. If it hadn't been that her father, blacksmith, an entrepreneur of sorts, drank and became an anger drunk, striking out at her mother, her life would seem good, settled, no fear. After all, Grandma was a hard worker and kind, feeding the hungry men that would pass through the town on the railroads and found her way to their door. It was a depression. Life was hard, but Grandma was good, strong in faith and strong in the love for her family. Grandpa and Grandma were married over 50 years before they both died of illness in their 80s. My father was the youngest of 4 children and had 1 older brother and 2 older sisters. He lived with his father and mother, and according to my aunt who told me this years ago, their father was a truly gentle and kind man who would even tear up if he had to discipline the children. One day he was dashing to work and was about to get into the car of a friend when he remembered he had forgotten to kiss his youngest child goodbye. He ran back, kissed my father, and said, "I hope you become a priest." With that, he jumped into the waiting car and it sped off. He never saw his father again. The man driving the car tried to outrun a train and was hit on the tracks, and my father's father was killed, his body found in pieces. That day, as anyone who has lost a parent to early death knows, you don't just lose one parent, but often 2, as the other parent has to take up more responsibilities and isn't as available as before. The depression touched most everyone then, and his mother took on boarders and did ironing and cleaning for wealthy families to provide for her children. Sometimes she would have to take the train to see her parents and would leave her children home with the boarders. The death of my father's father was a truly traumatic event and affected my dad in ways he had not planned nor could he foresee. My Nana, as we called his mother, lived into her mid-70s and died of illness and age. I always remember her as a gentle woman. Whenever we went to visit my aunt and uncle who she lived with, I slept in her big double bed, but eventually I had to sleep in the living room on cushions because I would accidentally kick her legs at night when I was sleeping. My siblings slept upstairs with my cousins. I always felt separated from them and wished I could sleep upstairs too. And now I digress. When my father actually did grow up from a child, he did enter into a monastery to become a priest. But when World War II came, he left to enter the army and was a military chaplain serving stateside. After the war was over, he never returned to the monastery, but began to work in social services and eventually met my mother in the courthouse where she worked. They fell in love, and as my mom told me, I loved it when we went on picnics and he would read poetry to me. I never really understood any of it, but I loved to hear him reading it, and she would laugh. My mother was apprehensive about marriage, but after my father wrote her a letter, which I still have in my possession, a letter assuring her that with faith in God they would be able to make their marriage and home a happy one, she accepted his proposal. So they married. She was 28 and he was 33. It wasn't long, and us children came along to add joy and laughter in those early years. From my birth to the age of 6, my life was filled with joy, fun, and love. I was born, as my mother told me, on a beautiful winter's day with the bright blue skies and the sun shining. My mother had always loved red hair, and so she was happy to see the strawberry blonde hair that stood up like a shock of corn on top of my head. My eyes were blue like my parents', except with a bit of green. Only God knew what things I would see with my eyes, hear with my ears, and feel with my heart. Although I know writers like to discuss the when, how, why, and where of providing backstory or past events, it is of utmost importance to my story that you know about the first 5 to 6 years of my life. Well, my sisters were my playmates and my teachers. In fact, my mother said she never had to potty train me because I learned from watching my sisters, and I began to use a toilet somewhere between the age of 1 and 2. I loved my sisters, and my mother made up all sorts of games, stories, and songs for us. When a brother was born just 2 years after me, I had another sibling to love and play with. I enjoyed pretending he was my twin, especially since we were about the same size, at least for a while. We were fed well, loved well, and treated well. One of my father's sisters and her family lived across the street from us, and their girls and son, who were older than me, were playmates for my sisters. I kind of tagged along when I could. My little playmate beside my brother was a boy who could stand on his head, make me laugh, and enjoyed playing in the mud and making mud pies with me. Oh, how I enjoyed those years, and my mother was to me the best mom in the world, and my father was my hero. I loved his dark brunette hair and sparkling blue eyes. He loved to tease us all and had a variety of nicknames. Mine was Tizzylicious, because as I was told when I was an adult, I was always so busy and in a tizzy. As a young child, I would introduce myself to all kinds of people on my own, talk to strangers, dance around the house, and sing songs my mother and father taught me. In fact, I can still remember my mother holding me in her arms in the rocker singing songs to me like A Tisket a Tasket, Frosty the Snowman, Here Comes Peter Cottontail, and more. And no one could read a story like my mother. She used different voices for each character and made sounds and faces to make the words and pictures come alive on the page. I never got tired of her singing or reading. It's one of my favorite things. One time when my sisters got to go to a circus with my cousins and I couldn't, I was told I was too little. And I cried my heart out. But my mom got together boxes and stuffed animals and something for a baton and created within our living room a large circus parade. With great pomp, she made the sounds of a circus and marched around as the ringmaster. I laughed and then took my turn marching, ordering the animals into place and leading the circus parade. My mom was the center of my world. Dad was an avid outdoorsman. He would bring home fish, many so huge they seemed the length of me. I always felt safe with him in the family's ventures into parks, lakes, and the woods. Often he would come home from work, and he would bounce me on his knees as he sang, pony girl, won't you be my pony girl? Marry me, carry me, right across the plains." Then with larger bumping up and down of his legs, he would sing the last part even louder. "Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up, giddy up, whoa, my pony girl." He would lean me back almost to the floor as he held me securely by the arms. What a racket we made, as I laughed and cried out again. Laughing himself, he would straighten me on his knees, and off we'd go riding across the plains until he had worn himself out. Other times, music would be on as my mother finished getting the family supper ready, and I'd place my small feet on his big shoes, and off we'd go waltzing across the kitchen and dining room, like a prince and his princess at the ball. Once my aunt came up to me after I had climbed in a tree near her house, upset by something that had occurred at her home, and she said, "You are your daddy's little teapot, aren't you?" I smiled, and that made me feel better, so I climbed down from the tree and went back with her to her home. It was and is obvious to me my parents loved us, their children. We'd go with relatives or friends to various parks or picnics and to enjoy the great outdoors. Our mother taught us how to breathe in the good, clean air by taking breaths, deep breaths, holding it in, and letting it out slowly. I still enjoy doing that when I'm outdoors. In winter, we would skate. It was a thrill to be pulled on the sled by my father on the ice who swung us around in wide arcs across the frozen pond as we cried out various sounds and words of delight. We went to parades, picnics, parties, church weekly, church bazaar, Santa's workshop, and to look at the baby chicks in the window of a store during Easter. We would go on trips to visit my other relatives that lived further away on both my father and mother's sides. I loved those visits and always found something interesting at each home and each visit. My favorite was when we would be given ice cream treats by some of my aunts, as we didn't have those except on special vacations or occasions. But my mother always seemed to have fresh baked cookies or cakes or breads or other things for us. We even had a jar in which my mother stashed special candy treats. We called it the sunshine jar. I have that jar today, and it still has special treats in it. My life was one of stability, love, and lots of adventure and fun. But all that changed when my father, who was working as a civil engineer in the large city we lived in, ended his job and took a job as a social worker in a much smaller town. He was looking forward to helping others in the way he was trained to do and in a way his heart had called him to. Our belongings were packed up into the large moving van as friends and neighbors watched. The other moms and children sat on blankets spread out on the front lawn. It was a big change, and we would be 8 hours away from them. There were hugs and goodbyes and a lunch packed for us to eat on the road as my father headed the car towards a new job, and circumstances, stresses, and changes he could have not foreseen. We settled in a rented home and became acquainted with the small town. Before long, we had new friends, attended a new church, were registered for school for the upcoming fall, and discovered new parks and places to have our picnics and outdoor adventures. My mother became friends with other women in our neighborhood. They all met weekly at what was called a coffee clutch, which basically was the ladies gathering together for coffee and some type of coffee cake at one of the homes. It would last an hour or two as they chatted and enjoyed the company of each other. All of us kids usually played outside, and we all knew which house to run to if somebody got hurt. I enjoyed our new neighborhood because I was a tomboy at the time, which was a term for a girl that likes adventure and likes to do things boys usually did. There was a swamp with huge trees to climb, felled logs to balance and walk on through marshy wet areas, and an actual tree fort built by some of the older boys in the neighborhood. It was off limits to girls and younger kids. You had to pass their test to qualify for the club by climbing the tree in a certain amount of time, running, and finding one of your shoes that was thrown in the marsh while your back was turned. I passed them all, but they didn't want a girl in the club, much less a small girl with a big can-do attitude. They said I cheated and peeked when they threw my shoe. I didn't, but I went home and got another shoe and insisted they try it again. I went through 2 pairs of shoes and a pair of sandals that day. I was going back to get another when my mother caught me and found out what was going on. My parents were not thrilled, and I was told the fort was for the bigger boys only. After that, I discovered I liked to climb the locust tree in the backyard, way up to the branches, just inches in diameter. I could hang on up there and blow back and forth in the summer breeze. My mother, on the other hand, would stick her head out the second-floor window and yell across to the top of that tree where I was hanging on as it swayed back and forth and back and forth. She'd yell out using my full name, first, middle, and last, and added with emphasis, "Get down before you fall down." I tried repeatedly to tell her I was safe, but she insisted, and down I came. She told my father, and after that I only did it a time or 2 more before I decided he was probably right, that those branches at the top were not as strong as I thought, and they were not made for little girls or anyone else to stand on and blow in the wind. So I had to stick to log walking, climbing trees, bouncing on tree limbs, and pulling green onions out of parts of the marshy area. If I got bored, I simply rode my bike down the alley to jump the dirt hill at the end that was alongside a small field. My mom told me I learned how to ride the bike basically on my own at her home in the bigger town. I was shown by my dad one evening, and the next day while he was at work, I practiced all day long until I was able to ride up and down a cement sidewalk. Mom said Nana watched you from the windows, and she admired my persistence and my will to not quit and give up. Yes, I was a risk taker even back then. I even jumped off our flat-top garage roof at the age of 6 to the grass below. I was in kindergarten and first grade when I did that until my parents found out and put an end to that too. Some of the older kids did it. I was not afraid of much, even Gut Swamp, a shady swamp several blocks away that had trees with slime and vines on in a green scummy pond with a small rotting raft and the bones of a dead cat on it. I'd just try about anything, and I would talk to just about anybody in those days. Life was good and we were happy. However, unbeknownst to us, something was occurring that as yet had not shown itself. As our days in a new home turned into weeks and weeks turned to months, our father seemed to be changing. Instead of coming home and being the light-hearted father I had experienced my first 6 years of life, he began to come home and question my mother at the dinner table as we were eating. "What do you do all day when I'm gone?" She was not used to the question or the anxious tone of his voice. As the days passed, my father continued to ask that same question of my mother, often adding, "What's going to happen to you and the children if something happens to me?" He would grill her on what she did, and she would stumble around with her words, visibly upset, trying not to cry, and she'd attempt to explain to him what she did. I do the wash and clean and take care of the children." He might interrupt sometimes as she listed her duties and activities to repeat, "Yes, but what else can you do? What's going to happen to you and the children if something happens to me?" This was very distressing. Us kids would stop eating and look at Dad. He was like someone I didn't know as he grilled my mother. Finally, one time, I had had enough. Prior to this particular time, I would say, "Daddy, Mommy does do stuff. She's busy all day long." But it never seemed to register with him. This continued to occur at the dinner table, and it seemed to be getting more frequent. On one particular time, my father grilled my mother. She began to cry. I had never had any reason to fear my father from before, so I shouted, "Daddy, stop being a bully!" Like a tightly wound clock that spring just sprung, his right arm came out and hit me hard across my face, sending my chair skittering across the kitchen floor and into the wall. My mother shouted out my father's name, and my father in a split second was on his knees next to my chair, apologizing for what he had just done. "Daddy's so sorry. Daddy didn't mean to do it." I sat hurt and stunned. The other children were silent. My mother tried to comfort me as my father apologized, and my life, as I had known it before, had just changed. So I want to thank you. I know this may be kind of a cliffhanger for you to have to end on, but I don't want to have these too long. So please join me next week as I do part 2 of my story and testimony, The Social Worker's Daughter, The Power of Love, Faith, and Forgiveness. Thank you once again for joining me. Please like, share, and then subscribe to my channel. Until next time, bye.